and welcome to Lifelong Learning at Roden Library. I'm Librarian Joyce Ellison here with my colleagues Renee House and Jan Thomas. Today we'll be talking to Georgia River expert Joe Cook. And now to tell you more about Joe and Joe's new Ocmulgee River User's Guide is Pulaski River's Love Chairman, Chuck Sutherland.
I want you to meet my friend Joe Cook. He lives in Rome, Georgia. He had to speak. He spoke today at the Rotary Club in Cochran, so I had the opportunity to get him here without him having to travel so far. And I appreciate you coming, Joe. Joe was, he is a river person. That's all he's done practically that I know of. At one time, Joe was the executive director of the Coosa River Initiative. The Coosa River's in North Georgia, north central Georgia, and that's kind of like a river keeping program there. Currently, Joe works for the Georgia River Network. He's going to talk a little bit about what that is. River Network's office is in Athens, but Joe lives in Rome, and he works out of his house for the Georgia River Network. He is the coordinator of the annual Georgia Paddle Georgia event, in which he has done for about 20 years. And in 2007, Joe brought almost 200 people to Hawkinsville, and they came in canoes and kayaks after 7 days and 115 miles from Lake Jackson. And we were privileged to be able to do his River's End celebration at Mile Branch for him, and we had a lot of volunteers, and that's what this slideshow is behind me going on. That's from that Paddle Georgia River End celebration they had at Mile Branch Park. It was a 2-day celebration, and it was a whole lot of fun. I'm going to give you a little bit of idea of how big a paddle is. Joe coordinates all this. It's an educational event. They have educational programs every night. They know where they're going to stop and sleep every night. So when they came to Hawkinsville to get started, to go upriver, you do a shuttle. Well, I've done shuttles for 30 and 40 people at a time. That's pretty big for me. We borrow a county bus, and then we get extra trucks, and we move these boats around. Well, you can imagine what it is to do 200 people, and I think it's gotten up to close to 300 now sometimes. Well, how are you going to move when most people are going solo, which means it's a boat for every single person? And then you got to move all them people at the same time. So here come all these people to the city barn, and all these cars, a whole bunch of trucks and all, and had all these boats and all this gear. And Joe had 2 charter buses coming there, 2 big ones. And then he had a transfer truck come. So he loaded them charter buses up, and he put every one of them boats on that transfer truck and did the shuttle up to where they started. That's how big this thing is that he does. And then Joe also works for the Georgia River Network, and that's what we're here to talk about today is his new book, and he has written 6 of them so far. During this informal discussion, I wanted to talk a little bit about everything, you know, Paddle Georgia, his new book, and if y'all got any questions, just speak up and ask Joe. All right, thank y'all for coming, Joe.
I appreciate y'all coming out and hearing me gab, and I especially appreciate Chuck for all the work he's done down here on our rivers. When we were working on Paddle Georgia 2007, they said, well, the person you need to contact in Hawkinsville is this guy right here. And he helped us organize that fish fry for our group, and it was really helpful. And we're proud that kind of led to the development of Mile Branch Park. And that's what Georgia River Network is all about, is connecting communities with our rivers and getting people out on our rivers so they have a relationship with our river, because if you have a relationship with a river, you're a lot more likely to take care of that river. We work at the state level on state water policy. So we're down at the state capitol during the legislative session lobbying for laws that protect our rivers. And then we also work on water trails. like the Ocmulgee River Water Trail. One of Georgia River Network's board members, Kit Carson, who lives up in Macon, has been real instrumental in getting the Ocmulgee River Water Trail developed. And that's, you know, improving public access to our rivers, and making sure there's a place where you can get in the river and get out the river about a day's paddle apart. And so that's another one of our big initiatives is the water trail and getting water trails established all over the state. We're working on a water trail app right now. It'll be on your smartphone. You'll be able to get on your phone, and wherever you are, whatever water trails are near you will show up. It'll show you where you can get in the river, where you can get out of the river, what obstacles are there in a certain section of river. So those are some of the projects that Georgia River Network is working on. I'm the Paddle Georgia coordinator, but I also have the privilege of writing these guidebooks. I could have asked for a more fun job to research these rivers. The guidebooks tell you, where you can get in the river, where you can get out of the river, but they're also a lot more than that. I delve a lot into the cultural and natural history of the rivers. And in doing these books, what I've learned is that if you kind of dig around in the mud and the sand and the dirt of the river, you're going to find the story of our story. You find the story of the communities along the river, the story of our state, because we are all connected to the river in some form or fashion. The story that I always tell is that my grandparents, Patsy May Hubbard, what a name. Imagine naming your child Patsy May. Patsy May Hubbard was from Chamblee. My grandfather, Joe Hall Cook, was from down in near McDonough. And my grandmother worked in Atlanta. My grandfather liked to come to the big city from the country. They met at Grant Park, which is the place to be back in the early 1920s. The way they got to the park was via the streetcar system. The streetcar system, of course, was powered by what? Electricity produced at Morgan Falls Dam on the Chattahoochee, which was built in 1904. And I've grown up to be a river advocate, and river advocates don't like dams. Dams, especially canoeists, don't like dams because you have to carry your boat around them, and they mess up the river. They wipe out a lot of the native species that were there. So I am not a big fan of dams, but I tell everybody, if it weren't for Georgia Power's Morgan Falls Dam, I would not exist today. Because the streetcars brought my grandmother and grandfather together in Atlanta in the 1920s. So I'm going to tell you a few stories from the Ocmulgee River User's Guide. Chuck mentioned the Paddle Georgia trips that we do. We have usually between 300 and 400 people participate in the trips. It's the largest week-long canoe kayak trip in the country. We didn't do it last year, of course. We didn't do it this year. But rather than doing one big trip, we've done lots of smaller trips of about 30 people, trying to be safe with the pandemic. And so this year we've done about 18 trips altogether. Some of them have been day trips, some have been weekend camping trips. But we did do a 7-day trip with 30 people on the Flint River this summer. But one of the things that we do on our trips is we always pick an animal from that area to highlight, and we invite everybody to make up jokes about that animal. So it might be the robust red horse on the Ocmulgee. On the Flint this year, it was the gopher tortoise. Because the gopher tortoise is the state reptile. It's an endangered species. It used to be abundant here in South Georgia in the longleaf pine habitat, but as the longleaf pine habitat has been replaced with agriculture and that sort of thing, there's not as many places for the state reptile to live. And also, these gopher tortoises have a hard time reproducing. They're just not very successful in reproducing. And when they do have hatchlings, very few of them survive to adulthood. So some scientists were looking into that, trying to figure out, well, what is the problem with these gopher tortoises that they are so unsuccessful in reproducing? So they did some studies, and they did find out what the cause was. Y'all know what it was? It was erectile dysfunction. I didn't say they were good jokes. I said we just made up jokes about animals. Does anybody know the origins of the Ocmulgee River, the three rivers that form the Ocmulgee River? Chuck, you know this?
The yellow and,
Alcove
Alcovey,
and,
third one?
You ready?
What?
I read it. I got the books right here.
The south, yeah, the south, the yellow, and the Alcovey. That's from west to east. The south starts in southwest Atlanta, East Point area, and it actually flows underneath the downtown connector. And then the yellow and the Alcovey both start in the suburbs of Gwinnett County. But those three rivers come together up at Lake Jackson and form the Ocmulgee. So this guide includes guides to the yellow, the Alcovey, and the South River. The South River is a fascinating river. I didn't realize just how fascinating it is until I started researching, but you could write a whole book about the South River. But what a lot of people don't know, y'all are familiar with the water wars between Georgia and Alabama, right? We've been hearing about that since the 1990s. And that's all about Metro Atlanta's use of water, and of course the ag use of water down here in southwest Georgia. But what a lot of people don't know is that from Atlanta's very inception, there have always been water wars. Atlanta's first water source was on the South River. They dammed up a tributary of the South River. If you've ever been to Lakewood, that was Atlanta's original water supply, is Lakewood. And when they dammed up this tributary, all the mill operators downstream on the south said, whoa, wait a minute. When they shut off the spigot and dammed up that stream, it affected the water flows downstream, so the mill operators didn't have enough water to turn their mills. Also, when it rained and they had heavy rains, the city of Atlanta would release water from the reservoir, and it would complicate flooding issues downstream, and it would flood fields along the bottomlands along the South River. So by the 1880s, there were multiple lawsuits filed by downstream property owners against the city of Atlanta because of the operation of their water supply. And now here we are 150 years later, we're still dealing with those same issues. So I found that fascinating. But one of the mill operators was a fellow by the name of Charles Latimer. And he was one of the leaders of DeKalb County in the early 1800s through the mid-1800s. Nobody really knows Charles Latimer, but a lot of people know Charles Latimer's daughter, who grew up on his plantation there on the South River. And her name was Rebecca Latimer Felton. Any of y'all heard that name? She was the first woman to serve in the U.S. Senate in 1921. When she graduated from school, she met a man by the name of Robert Felton. Is that right? Robert Felton, who was the commencement speaker at her graduation. And they hooked up, and they formed quite a partnership. And he ran for U.S. Congress, and she kind of served as his campaign manager, which, of course, at that time was very unusual for a woman. And folks here in Georgia didn't think too much of it. The Thomasville Times wrote about Ms. Felton. You ladies, listen up here. We sincerely trust that the example set by Mrs. Felton will not be followed by Southern ladies. Let the dirty work of politics be confined to men. There is a higher, nobler, purer sphere for women. Let her fill it. She went on to become quite an activist. In her time, she was considered a progressive. She was a suffragette. She lobbied heavily to end the convict lease system in Georgia, which was a brutal system that really, it was basically worse than slavery, in which private companies leased the convicts and treated them horribly, worked them, in some cases, to the death. It didn't matter, they just get another prisoner. So it was a brutal system, and Rebecca Latimer Felton was a big advocate to end the convict lease system. She was also a suffragette and advocated for women's right to vote. But she used a very interesting argument to make her case. Like many at that time, she was a white supremacist. And when the Georgia General Assembly failed to ratify the 19th Amendment, she wrote, "The manifest preference of certain Georgia legislators for giving the franchise to Negro men over intelligent white women will become an incentive in years to come to vote against such misfits." So it was interesting that she was kind of labeled a progressive and a liberal at the time, but yet she used that argument to further the cause of women's right to vote. But she was appointed by the governor in 1920 to fill the term of a senator who had died in office, and she served 2 days in the Senate. The governor appointed her to the position purely on political terms. He wanted to run for that office, and he didn't want to appoint somebody that would be a competitor for him. And he also knew that the women had just gotten the right to vote, so he thought, well, if I appoint this woman to be senator, then I might be able to get some of those votes from the women that'll be new voters. So that's how Rebecca Latimer Felton came to be our first U.S. Senator. She spoke on the Senate floor. She said, when the women of the country come in and sit with you, though there may be but very few of them in the next few years, I pledge you that you will get ability, you will get integrity of purpose, you will get exalted patriotism, and you will get unstinted usefulness. Rebecca Latimer Felton, it all began right there on the South River at her father's plantation at Panola Shoals. Let's see, moving downriver, more stories to tell. Lloyd Shoals Dam, of course, forms Lake Jackson. At the time that it was built, 1911 to 1914, it was one of the largest dams in the country. It was a huge undertaking. And to do it, the Central Georgia Power Company needed investors, and they got their investors from the north. So they did what I call barbecue diplomacy. They invited all these northern industrialists to come down to the dam site, and they plied them with pork. And the Jackson Progress, Butts County Progress, covered the event in which all these northern capitalists were brought down to eat barbecue and persuade them to invest. The Progress wrote, "Northern capitalists do not sit down to a barbecue like that every day, and some of them doubted if their digestive apparatus was equal to the task. Quote, 'Take down the address of my wife and you can put my body in a plain box,' said one of the northern party who was doubtful of the outcome after he had partaken of a repast for some time and was being urged with true Georgia hospitality to eat more." So they did get the money for it. They built the dam, and it had unintended consequences. When the water started backing up, of course, it flooded the farm fields of those farmers that worked the bottomlands, but it also created an infestation of mosquitoes, and there was an outbreak of malaria. And people were obviously very angry that they were having to be subjected to this. They'd lost their land, and now they had mosquitoes and malaria. So they appealed to Governor Hoke Smith, and the governor came down, visited the area, fired off a letter to the power company, and the power company responded, as you might expect in that era. What did they do? They sent out a mosquito control squad. This mosquito control squad was responsible for spreading kerosene on the surface of the lake to kill the mosquitoes. They did this for a couple of decades into the 1930s. That's how they controlled mosquitoes on Lake Jackson. So I thought that was a very interesting story. How many of y'all remember the Atlanta Pop Festival? Were you there?
No.
Are you sure? Or you don't want to admit you were
I
there?
was too young.
Well, the Atlanta Pop Festival was held in Byron, which is along Itchicony Creek, which is a tributary of the Ocmulgee. And At that event, of course, there were hundreds of people, and it was the middle of the summer, and what do you do when you're hot? And there's a creek there, you get in the water and you swim. Well, this was 1970, a different era, different time, and the Atlanta Constitution reported on it. They wrote, as many as 400 were splashing in the creek at one point, and about 50 of them were nude. Numerous teenage girls walked bare-breasted through the area. Quite a sight for Middle Georgia in 1970. Our governor at the time, of course, was Lester Maddox. And you can imagine that Lester Maddox had something to say about this. The Constitution called him up, and Lester Maddox said, you would expect something like this going on in the jungle, but not here in America. The outspoken and controversial governor was out of the state that weekend. He was attending the New England Rally for God, Family, and Country in Boston. I love that story. You can't help but love Governor Maddox. My goodness. I always had something to say about something. This is another story about the Ocmulgee upstream from here, and some of y'all might remember these days. But when the Macon Craft Plant opened for business in Macon, it was a pulp mill, opened in 1948, and shortly after it opened and started producing the paper products, the discharges into the Ocmulgee River were causing fish kills and making the river nasty. And people downstream, and I'm sure a few from Hawkinsville, were up in arms over it, and they complained about it. And of course, at that time, there was no recourse for anybody because there were no laws that prevented a manufacturer from just dumping waste into our rivers. But enough people complained that the state attorney general did investigate and did ultimately get the company to agree to stop excessive discharges into the river. But in doing research on this, I came across an article in the Atlanta Constitution that I thought was particularly interesting. The headline read, quote, mills hard on finny ones, payrolls versus fish up for Georgia debate. State leaders came to the defense of the pulp mill and the jobs and tax revenue it created. Said the director of the state's Agricultural and Industrial Development Board, it's very important not to scare the pants off the entire paper industry. And that was kind of the attitude at the time. This was a time when Georgians there were not a lot of high-paying manufacturing jobs. We were still kind of a rural state. And when these industry came to Georgia, all of a sudden Georgians had good jobs and benefits, and we're making money. I talked with a fellow up in Rome that grew up on the Coosa River, a well-known fellow, Frank Barron. He ran the Coca-Cola bottling company up there in Rome. And he grew up on the river, and he said, at that time, it didn't matter that we were polluting our own swimming holes. We were finally making money. So it was easy to turn our backs on our rivers and just say, well, it's the cost of progress. And at that time, the thinking was, we can have jobs, or we can have clean rivers, but we can't have both. Of course, now we know that we can have jobs and we can have clean rivers at the same time. Cleaning up wastewater is not rocket science. We just have to invest in it. And so thankfully, we've done that. The craft plant is still operating up there in Macon, but they no longer pollute the river. So we're making progress. Let's see. I got to tell this story about Hawkinsville. Since we are here in Hawkinsville, it's really about Macon. But, into the late 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of money was spent, a lot of federal money was spent, quote, improving the Ocmulgee River, trying to make it navigable so that you could get a steamboat all the way from Darien up to Macon. If you go out on the river today, you'll still see posts in the river and straight lines. Those posts were kind of wing dams where they would try to constrict the river's flow and elevate the river so that you can get a steamboat through. There's many places where you can still see that. And all of those date back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. So Macon was very keen on making the Ocmulgee navigable. And in 1904, Macon business interests arranged a steamboat excursion to Hawkinsville, whose residents had planned a banquet to celebrate the town's common interest in developing the Ocmulgee River for river transportation. The Macon River boosters boarded a southbound steamer in town early in the morning and hoped to reach Hawkinsville before scheduled activities that evening. But by 3 p.m., they had gotten only as far as Bullard's Landing, which is about, I don't know, not more than 20 miles, I don't think. Not very far from Macon. So, with 40 river miles still to go, they departed the water and headed for the railroad, which was nearby at Bullard Station. As reported in the Hawkinsville Dispatch and News on February 19, 1904, although the banquet was a success, the demonstration of the river's navigability was less so. Among the speakers at the dinner was a representative from the Southern Railway, who was quick to note that the railroad took the Macon dignitaries on the final leg of their journey. He said the railroad supported river navigation, quipping, "Had it not been for navigation, the Southern would now have $20 less fare in its coffers." Little dig at river navigation there. The last steamboats on the river were probably 1930s, but the Corps of Engineers was still doing work well into the 40s on these rivers. And even as late as the 1960s and 70s, there was plans to build dams on the Ocmulgee and the Altamaha with locks to try to make the river navigable. So that idea did not die easily. I will tell one more story. I told this to the folks up in Cochrane. It's a story that took place nearby here. And it's about the Governor Troop, which was a steamboat that plied the river right before the Civil War. When the Confederacy was formed, the Confederate government purchased the Governor Troop, and they used the Governor Troop to collect tithes from all the farms along the Ocmulgee and the Oconee and the Altamaha River. The tithe was basically the Confederate government collected a portion of all the produce that was produced at the farms along the river to help fund and feed the Army and fund the Confederate government. So as you can imagine, the Governor Troop was not a popular sight along our rivers. So there were, at the time, the Union Army was down on the Georgia coast, and they made contact with a couple of Confederate deserters, a couple of men from Baxley, Georgia, and they said, "Hey, look, if you guys will go capture the Governor Troop and bring it to us, we'll give you X amount of money." And it was a considerable sum at the time. So these two Confederate deserters got a group of men together, and they went and they captured the Governor Troop. They sailed it down the river to Darien, but before they could get to the Union Army commander who had commissioned them to do this, the Union Navy intercepted them. And what ensued was a battle between the Union Army and the Union Navy over whose prize it was. Eventually, the Army got control of it, and they used it to move goods up and down the river kind of at the close of the war. Well, at the close of the war, the 72nd Indiana Volunteer Infantry was stationed at Buzzard's Roost Ferry, which is upriver just a little ways, at Westlake. It's all the same place. And their job was to check the papers of Confederate soldiers coming back across the river and going home to make sure that they had laid down their arms. And I ran across this story in their history, which is quite a dramatic story. I have to assume that it's true, but it is a dramatic story. During their stay, the Hoosiers hunted squirrels along the riverside, discovered official state papers of Tennessee that had been hidden in large trunks nearby, and witnessed firsthand the brutality of slavery when a young slave woman came to the ferry asking the Union soldiers for protection. Soon, the slave's master appeared, demanding her return. The Union commander acquiesced, but several soldiers surreptitiously tracked the pair. Quote, "The boys knew the plantation where she belonged, and started toward the swamp as if going after squirrels. When out of sight, they quickened their pace and soon came in sight of the Negro quarters, and when within a quarter of a mile of the place, heard the cries of the poor unfortunate girl as the bloody lash was plied to her naked back. The three boys in blue rushed in, and in language more forcible than elegant, ordered the hostilities to cease. The bloody victim was released, and the overseer ordered to strip to the belt. No mercy was shown, and the heartless brute who a few minutes before gloated over the misery and suffering of his victim was now made to feel the potency of his own treatment. The girl was also released from these devils and given freedom. As the soldiers neared the end of their duty at the ferry, captured riverboats, the governor troop, brought to them relief. Quote, "Today we heard one of those boats whistle, and the sound came rolling up through the swamp like a harbinger of peace and goodwill. In about an hour, the governor troop came slowly winding up through the trees and landed below our ferry. She was loaded with commissary stores. You may never know how we laughed to see a cracker box once more. It had been nearly 2 months since we had seen one, and with hearts overflowing with gratitude, we felt like showering unnumbered blessings upon the head of the man who invented hardtack. It took the boat 8 days to make the trip from Savannah, and some of our boys who were on the boat as guards had a fine time shooting alligators as they came up. A shot from an ordinary rifle has but little effect on their tough old hides, but our Spencers went to the spot every time. The men had a very large one, 8 feet long on board, which they had just killed." So that is the story of the Union Army right here in these parts in 1865, and the story of the Governor Troop. All happened right here. So I could go on, but I won't. If y'all have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. And we'll go from there. If y'all have any stories to tell, it's always fun to come to river towns, and somebody will inevitably told me a story, as they did in Cochran, about if I'd only known that, I would have put it in the book. Anyway, if y'all have any questions.
I didn't realize the Lake Jackson Dam was as large as you said it was when it was built.
Oh yeah, it was a big deal.
It's a beautiful dam. I've been there, and it's completely level across the top, and it's the back of it. You can stand down in rocks and look at it, and it just water flows all the way across. It just flows down like a 45 degree or something. So, and that is actually where the Ocmulgee River starts, where those 3 rivers you talked about come into that lake,
Right.
and then right below the dam is where the head of the Ocmulgee. And you've done a book on the Oconee, and now you've done the Ocmulgee,
Yes.
and Oconee and Ocmulgee join down in Hazelhurst,
Yeah, near Hazelhurst.
and then it turns into the Ocmulgee.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And I'm currently working on a book about the Ocmulgee.
That's right.
So,
Hey, Joe, I know you're fairly intimately acquainted with the Ocmulgee. What's your favorite stretch of water on the Ocmulgee to float? Or do you have one?
I don't know, that's a tough question. The stretch from Jackson Lake down to Macon is a real pretty section. That's a lot of shoals, and it's real pretty. But there's some sections. The section from here in Hawkinsville downstream is really nice. There's some nice limestone bluffs, and there's some interesting shoals. I think there might even be some Native American fish weirs, some V-shaped rock dams. I saw some things at low water that maybe suspiciously look like the fish dams on the Etowah River, which I'm real familiar with. So the section from Hawkinsville downstream is real nice.
Joe just paddled the Ocmulgee with some other people, I think.
Yeah.
How many days did it take you there?
We did 6 days.
6 days. He did this just to scout it out and to get ready for this book he's doing.
Yeah.
He started at the beginning of Ocmulgee. And by the way, the Oconee, I was kind of amazed when I first saw it. The Oconee and the Ocmulgee almost meet head on.
Yeah, they do. They come right at each other.
And it's just, you can feel it in your boat when you go over.
Yeah, it's interesting. It really is.
Hey, Joe.
Yes.
I'm a member of the AWWA, which is the American Water Works Association.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and I think it's the end of the month, they're gonna have a Source Water Week,
Uh-huh.
about the rivers and all that.
And that's where they discuss where your water comes from.
Right,
Yeah, yeah. It's, yeah, a lot of people, if you ask most people, where do you get your drinking water?
they don't know.
Most people don't know.
And Sam and the Georgia Association of Water Professionals too.
Yes.
Everybody above us gets that water out of Ocmulgee, don't
Macon does,
Yeah.
yeah, Macon does.
they? What about Warner Robin?
Warner Robins, I don't think they do. I think they pump it from the ground.
So that's unreal that these people in Atlanta above us pump this water out of rivers and clean it up enough that you can drink it.
And then they clean it up to go back into the river after they go through the
Yeah.
wastewater treatment
And they
plant.
say that the water coming out of a wastewater treatment plant, if it is working right, is cleaner than the water that's in the river.
See, I've been to the water plant in Macon,
Mm-hmm.
and that's something to see.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, if you've never had a chance to visit a sewage treatment plant or a water treatment plant, it's fascinating. My daughter is at Georgia Tech right now. She's studying environmental engineering. I told her, I said, you know what environmental engineers do? They end up working at sewage treatment plants. I said, you're a proctologist among engineers.
Right.
So, she graduates this spring, so hopefully she will be gainfully employed. I don't, think she wants to work at a wastewater treatment plant, but, I think she wants to do stream restoration, but we'll see. Yes.
I can't emphasize enough how big a deal Powell, Georgia is, y'all, and what Joe, he puts all this together. And he's talking about 300 people or more, but his 200 came to Hawkinsville. That was a lot.
Yeah.
90, almost double that, and for him to move, to have it all arranged for the whole week, and to move these people around, and you actually move them around sometimes from where you take out the river at night. Don't y'all stay some other places sometimes?
Yeah, we'll usually have 2 or 3 campsites during the week, and so 2 or 3 times during the week, we'll move to a new campsite. If we have a dam to portage around, we'll load all the boats up and portage them around the dam. It's like moving a small army, but it is a lot of fun, it really is. It's become, over the past 16 years, it's become, a lot of the same people come each year, so it's kind of a community reunion. A lot of families come, so we've seen children grow up and, go from being little kids to going off to college
And
and
you
stuff.
saw this video, he saw this stuff, that's
Oh, yeah.
14 years old, he said, see that little boy right there? He's the doctor now.
Yeah. So now a doctor, so making us feel old. Well, if y'all have any other questions, we do have books to sell. Chuck is selling them at his office, but if y'all want to pick up a book today, they're available. I'll be happy to sign them.
Oh, I got all mine, I'll get you to sign mine.
Excellent, excellent. That'll make the value of them, grow tenfold. Anyway, I appreciate y'all having me, and thanks for hearing me.
Well, Joe, thank you for educating us on our wonderful home river, the mighty Ocmulgee.
Yes.
And we thank you, Chuck Sutherland and Rivers Alive, for helping make this program possible. We thank each one of you for being with us on a bad weather afternoon.